The air in the great hall of the Albright Conservatory was thick with the scent of old wood, floor wax, and the faint dusty perfume of 1,000 forgotten performances. It was late afternoon, and the sun, now low and golden, threw long, dramatic shadows across the polished stage, making the empty chairs of the orchestra look like a silent, waiting audience. For the three people seated at the long table in the center of the hall, its grandeur had long since faded into a tedious backdrop. They were the scholarship committee, and they were exhausted. The man at the center, the one with a carefully trimmed silver beard and a suit that seemed to hold the shape of the day's weariness, let out a breath that was almost a sigh. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, his eyes closing for just a moment too long. He had heard 6 hours of music today. 6 hours of notes. Some played with breathtaking speed, others with flawless precision. But most of it felt like it came from a machine rather than a soul. He was thinking about the bottle of Merlot waiting for him at home, and the simple, profound silence he would enjoy it in. He just needed to get through this last one. To his left sat a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that were currently hidden behind a pair of red-rimmed glasses. She was massaging her temples with her fingertips, a small, rhythmic motion that betrayed a headache brewing behind her eyes. She was the heart of the committee, the one who always tried to find the spark, the hidden story in the music. But today, the sparks were few and far between. The last applicant, a young man with fingers that flew across the piano keys like a blur, had played a Liszt etude with such technical fire that it should have been thrilling. Instead, it was just loud. It was a perfect, hollow, and ultimately forgettable performance. She had found herself staring at the ornate carvings on the ceiling, counting the angels. Anything to escape the noise. The third member of the panel was much younger. A man in his late 20s with the restless energy of someone still trying to prove he belonged in this room. He was a composer, and he listened with a critical ear, dissecting every phrase, mentally cataloging every tiny deviation from the score. He valued perfection above all else. For him, music was a structure of mathematical beauty, and emotion was a messy, unpredictable variable. He had been impressed by the Liszt player, even if the others hadn't. He saw the control, the hours of practice, the sheer discipline. He tapped his pen on his notepad, eager to find something he could approve of without reservation. Something clean and easy to judge. An assistant, a young woman who looked almost as tired as the panel, poked her head in from the side door. "We have one more for today if you're ready," she said softly. The man with the silver beard waved a hand, a gesture of weary permission. "Send them in. Let's finish this." The door opened, and a young woman stepped onto the stage. She couldn't have been more than 20. She wasn't wearing the formal black dress or sharp suit that most applicants chose. She was in a simple, plain gray skirt and a faded blue blouse, the kind of clothes you wear for comfort, not for show. Her shoes were scuffed and worn at the heels, and they made no sound on the vast stage as she walked toward the single music stand placed under the spotlight. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid that fell over one shoulder, and a few stray strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale and serious but not frightened. She carried a violin case that looked almost as old as she was, its corners worn smooth with use. The youngest member of the panel leaned forward, his pen poised. He immediately noted her posture as she walked a little too relaxed. Not the ramrod straight posture of a classically trained performer. He made a small, almost invisible check mark in his mental ledger. The woman with the glasses, however, felt a flicker of curiosity. There was an intentionality in the girl's quiet walk, a sense of purpose that was different from the nervous energy or cocky arrogance she'd seen all day. This girl wasn't here to show off. She was here to do a job. The girl stopped at the center of the stage, placing her violin case gently on the floor beside her. She looked out at the panel, her gaze calm and steady. She didn't fidget or look away. "Name and peace, please," the silver-bearded man said, his voice flat and professional. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice clear but soft, carrying easily in the quiet hall. "I will be playing the Chocana from Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor." A silent, shared groan seemed to pass through the three of them. It was an unspoken wave of resignation. The chaconne? It was Mount Everest for a solo violinist, a monumental piece of music that was both technically and emotionally devastating. Every serious player attempted it. It was a staple of these auditions, and they had heard it at least a dozen times that week alone. They expected a frantic race through the notes, a display of athletic prowess that would miss the point of the music entirely. They wanted something easy, something they could dismiss or approve in 5 minutes. The chacon was never easy. The man with the silver beard settled deeper into his chair, preparing himself for the long 15-minute ordeal. The composer's pen was ready to circle every flaw. The woman with the glasses took a deep breath, silently praying for a miracle she didn't really expect to come. Alara knelt and opened her violin case. The latches opened with a quiet, satisfying click. She lifted the instrument from its velvet bed. It wasn't a gleaming, priceless Stradivarius. It was a simple, unadorned violin, its wood a warm, deep honey color, darkened in places where her hands had touched it thousands of times. It looked like a friend, not an artifact. She held it for a moment, not in a showy way, but with a quiet reverence, like she was greeting an old companion. She didn't obsessively check the tuning or rosin her bow with nervous energy. She simply tucked the violin under her chin resting naturally on the worn chin rest, and lifted the bow. The 3 committee members watched her, their expressions a mixture of boredom and impatience. They saw a girl, a simple instrument, and the daunting prospect of one more butchered masterpiece. They saw the end of a very long day. They leaned back, their minds already drifting, wanting it to be over. But Alara wasn't looking at them anymore. Her eyes had closed. Her entire focus had turned inward. She took a single, slow breath, and in that moment, the entire atmosphere in the hall shifted. The air grew still. The tiredness of the panel, the dust motes in the sun, the shadows on the floor, it all seemed to hold its breath. She wasn't a nervous applicant anymore. She was a priestess at an altar, and the music was her prayer. And they, her unwitting congregation, were about to hear a sermon they never could have predicted. The bow in Alara's hand didn't move with the sharp, aggressive attack they were bracing for. It descended upon the strings with the gentleness of a falling leaf, and the sound that was born from that contact was not the bold, declarative D minor that should have filled the hall. It was something else entirely. It was a note so thin, so fragile, it felt like it might break before it reached their ears. It hung in the air like a wisp of smoke, a question whispered in an empty room. It wasn't a note of performance. It was a note of memory, a ghost of a sound from a time long past. The man with the silver beard, whose name was on a dozen prestigious music theory textbooks, felt a jolt of pure annoyance. His jaw tightened. This was not what was on the program. This was not batch. This was unprofessional, an affectation, a cheap trick to get attention. His hand, resting on the table, curled slightly, ready to be raised. He was a fraction of a second from clearing his throat, from stopping this nonsense and reminding the young woman of the piece she had announced. He had a schedule to keep, a bottle of wine to drink, and he would not be toyed with. But before he could move, before the sound of his own breath could interrupt, a second note emerged from the violin. It was just as quiet as the first, but it was different. It was a response. The 2 notes, hanging in the vast silence of the hall, began a conversation with each other. Then a 3rd note joined, and a 4th. Slowly, carefully, a melody began to form. It was a simple tune, the kind of melody you might hum to yourself without realizing it. A line of music that felt both ancient and deeply personal. It was sad, but not in a dramatic, weeping way. It was a quiet, settled sadness. It's the kind that lives in your bones after a long life. The man's hand, which had been poised to stop the performance, remained frozen on the table. The annoyance in his chest didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, a strange and unwelcome feeling. The music was bypassing the part of his brain that analyzed structure and technique. It was slipping past his defenses, finding a small locked door inside him and turning the key. He was suddenly, vividly reminded of a cold winter morning when he was a boy, standing at a window and watching his father leave for a long trip. He hadn't felt that specific sharp ache in over 50 years. He hadn't even known the memory was still there. He blinked, and the image was gone, but the feeling remained. A hollow echo in his chest. Beside him, the woman with the red-rimmed glasses felt her headache begin to dissolve. She had been bracing for another assault of technical noise, but this was the opposite. This was a bomb. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table, her chin propped in her hands. The melody was like a thread being pulled from a tangled skein, and she was following it, curious to see where it would lead. It spoke of simple things: the warmth of a sunbeam on a wooden floor, the feeling of a heavy quilt, the taste of bread fresh from the oven. It was the music of home, but a home that was lost, a home that perhaps only existed in memory. She found herself holding her breath, afraid that if she made a sound, the fragile melody would shatter. The youngest member of the committee, the composer, was utterly lost. His pen was still poised over his notepad, but he wasn't writing. He was frowning, his mind racing. What was this? It wasn't Bach. It wasn't any modern composer he knew. It had the simple modal structure of a folk tune, but it was too complex, too emotionally nuanced for that. It felt improvised, yet every note seemed deliberate, perfectly placed. He was trying to analyze it, to break it down into its components: key, time signature, harmonic progression, but the music refused to be pinned down. It was like trying to capture mist in a jar. The more he tried to grasp it, the more it slipped through his intellectual fingers. For the first time all day, he wasn't judging. He was simply, profoundly confused. Alara on the stage seemed completely unaware of their presence. Her eyes were still closed, her body swaying with a gentle, almost imperceptible rhythm. She was not playing to them. She was playing for the music itself. The simple, sad melody began to grow. It didn't get louder, but it became fuller, richer. New layers were added, subtle harmonies that seemed to bloom from the original tune. It was like watching a black and white photograph slowly gain color. The story it was telling was becoming clearer. It was a story of resilience, of finding beauty in hardship, of a small light burning steadily in a great darkness. The man with the silver beard found himself leaning back in his chair, his body relaxing against his will. The professional facade. The armor of cynicism he had built over decades of listening to ambitious but soulless musicians was crumbling. He was no longer a judge in a hall. He was a man sitting in the quiet, listening to a story about his own life, a story he didn't even know he needed to hear. He thought about his wife, not the woman she had become in her final years. Frail and confused by illness, but the young woman he had fallen in love with, the one who would dance in the kitchen to a song on the radio. He felt a prickle behind his eyes and quickly looked down at his hands, annoyed at his own lack of control. And then something truly strange happened. Woven into the fabric of her own simple, haunting melody, Ilara introduced a new phrase. It was just a few notes, a familiar shape in the landscape of her music. It was a fragment of the Bach chaconne, but it wasn't a direct quote. It was like a memory of a memory. She had taken the essence of Bach's theme and bent it, reshaped it, to fit the key of her own sorrow. It was there and then it was gone. A fleeting glimpse of a familiar face in a crowd of strangers. The woman with the glasses gasped softly. She knew the chaconne inside and out. She had studied it, taught it, and wept over it. She recognized the fragment instantly, but she had never heard it sound like that. It was as if Alara was having a conversation with Bach across the centuries, not as a student to a master, but as an equal. She was taking his towering monument of grief and showing him the small, human heart that beat at its core. The composer's head snapped up. His pen finally moved, scribbling furiously. He wasn't analyzing anymore. He was transcribing, trying to capture the miracle that was happening. She was blending two completely different musical worlds, her own private folk-like melody and the rigid, mathematical structure of Baroque music hand, making them sound like they had always belonged together. It was impossible. It defied every rule of composition he had ever been taught, and yet it was the most natural, most beautiful thing he had ever heard. They were no longer bored. They were no longer tired. The three of them sat frozen, captivated. Their own personal histories and professional opinions swept away by a current of sound that was more real than reality itself. They had wanted something easy, something simple to judge so they could go home. But what she was giving them was something else entirely. It was unreal. It was a glimpse into a soul, and it was changing them, note by note, whether they wanted it to or not. The world for Alara had shrunk to the small space between her chin and the strings of her violin. The great hall, the three judges, the golden sunlight, none of it existed anymore. She was floating in an ocean of sound, a world she had built from memory and feeling. Her body moved with a life of its own, a gentle sway that was not a performance, but a surrender. She was no longer Alara, the nervous applicant. She was a vessel, and the music was pouring through her, telling a story that was hers and yet belonged to everyone who had ever loved and lost. The simple, sorrowful melody that had opened the door to this world began to change. It was like watching a gray sky slowly clear. The sadness was still there, a deep and steady current, but a new sound began to ripple across its surface. It was a melody of resilience, of finding the strength to take another step after a fall. It wasn't a triumphant, marching kind of strength. It was quieter, more personal. It was the strength of a single weed pushing through a crack in the concrete, strength of a hand reaching for another hand in the dark. The music began to breathe, to pulse, with a gentle, steady rhythm, like a heart that had been broken but was still beating, still determined to live. The man with the silver beard felt this shift in his own chest. The memory of his wife's laughter, which had been so sharp and painful at first, began to soften. It was no longer just a ghost from the past. It felt present, real. He could almost see her standing in their little kitchen, her feet bare on the cool linoleum, a flower smudge on her cheek as she tried to teach him how to dance a clumsy waltz. The music Alara was playing wasn't the waltz they had danced to, but it held the same feeling. It held the joy of being clumsy together, the joy of not needing to be perfect. He had spent his entire adult life pursuing perfection in music, dissecting it, categorizing it, teaching others to replicate it with flawless precision. He had forgotten that the most beautiful moments in life were imperfect, messy, and real. A single tear escaped his control and traced a slow, warm path down his wrinkled cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, a small, salty tribute to a memory he had kept locked away for too long. Beside him, the woman with the glasses was no longer just listening. She was in conversation with the music. The quiet joy she heard rising from the sorrow was a language she understood fluently. She had dedicated her life to this art form, and it had asked for everything. It had taken her time, her energy, and the chances for a different kind of life. One with a family and children, and the simple noisy chaos she sometimes saw in the park on her way home. There were days when she wondered if the sacrifice had been worth it. If the sterile perfection of the concert hall was a fair trade for the warmth of a child's hug, this music was her answer. It was telling her that her quiet life had its own music, its own deep and profound beauty. It was validating every lonely night spent practicing, every missed birthday, every moment of doubt. The melody was a mirror, and for the first time in a long time, she liked what she saw. She wasn't just a professor or a judge. She was a woman who had made a choice, and this music was telling her it was a good one. Her shoulders, which had been tense with fatigue for hours, finally relaxed. A tear slid down her cheek, too, but it was a tear of release, of gratitude. The young composer was in a state of intellectual crisis. His pen had stopped moving. His mind, which was usually a busy, orderly library of musical theory and form, was in chaos. He couldn't understand what was happening. The music Alara was playing broke all the rules. It shifted keys without warning. It used chords that should have clashed, but instead created a feeling so poignant it almost hurt. It was structurally unsound, emotionally erratic, and utterly breathtakingly brilliant. He was trying to build a box to put it in. A box labeled folk fusion or deconstructed Baroque, but the music refused to be contained. It was spilling out of every box he tried to create. And then he realized his mistake. He was trying to understand it with his head, but this music wasn't for the head. It was for the heart. He put his pen down, the scratching sound suddenly loud and rude in the enchanted silence of the hall. He gave up. He stopped analyzing and just let the music wash over him, letting it break him apart and put him back together again. He was learning more in these few minutes than he had in 4 years of university. He was learning that the most important notes are the ones you can't write on a page. As the music swelled, Ilara began to weave more of the bat chakan into her tapestry of sound. But now it was different. The fragments were no longer fleeting glimpses. They were fully integrated, transformed. She took a bold, ascending run from Batch's masterpiece and slowed it down, stretching each note until it became a cry of longing. She took a powerful, rhythmic dance section and softened it, turning it into a gentle, rocking lullaby of memory. It was as if she had taken the great stone cathedral that Bach had built and was showing them the warm, human lives that were lived within its walls. She was having a conversation with the ghost of a genius, not as a student, but as a fellow traveler on the same road of sorrow and joy. She was honoring him not by copying him, but by understanding him, by adding her own voice to his and creating something new, something that had never existed before and would never exist again. The performance was unreal. It wasn't a display of technical skill, although her control over the instrument was absolute. It was a display of soul. It was terrifying in its honesty because it was impossible to fake. Every note was saturated with a truth so pure and raw, it felt almost indecent to be witnessing it. The three of them sat motionless, their own hearts laid bare by a girl with a simple violin and a story to tell. They had come wanting something easy, a simple task to complete before they could go home to their quiet lives. But she had given them something else. She had given them back a piece of themselves they thought they had lost forever. The hall was no longer just a room. It was a sacred space, and the music was its prayer, a prayer of loss, of survival, and of the terrifying, beautiful, and utterly unreal honesty of a single human heart. The final note from Ilara's violin did not end with a sharp, clean cut. It did not demand applause or signal a finish. It simply gave up. The sound, which had grown to fill every corner of the vast hall, began to shrink, pulling back into itself like a tide going out an impossible distance. It grew softer and thinner, becoming a fragile thread of sound that vibrated in the air for a moment. Last whispered word, and then it was gone. And in its place, a silence was born. This was not the ordinary silence that falls between movements of a piece, or the polite, expectant silence of an audience waiting to applaud. This was a different kind of silence. It was a presence. It was heavy and thick, pressing down on them, filling the space where the music had been with a profound and startling emptiness. It was the silence you feel in a forest after a gunshot, the silence that follows a piece of news so shocking it stops your heart. For 10 long seconds, no one in the hall moved. No one breathed. It was as if they were all afraid that any sound, even the smallest rustle of a sleeve or the quietest intake of breath, which would shatter the delicate sacred spell that had been woven around them. The dust motes, which had been dancing in the golden sunlight, seemed to hang suspended in the air, frozen in time. The man with the silver beard stared at his own hands, which were resting flat on the polished table in front of him. They were not the hands of a powerful, respected academic. They were just hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, and they were trembling. A fine, almost invisible tremor ran through his fingers, a physical echo of the earthquake that had just rumbled through his soul. He felt stripped bare, as if the music had reached into his chest and pulled out all his carefully constructed defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. He had spent 50 years building a wall around his heart, a wall made of theory, of analysis, of intellectual superiority. And this girl, this quiet girl with a worn violin, had not knocked the wall down. She had simply walked through it as if it were made of smoke. He felt a wave of something so powerful it was almost nausea, a mix of shame for his own arrogance, and a terrifying, breathtaking awe on his left. The woman with the glasses was no longer massaging her temples. Her headache was gone, completely forgotten. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. A single tear had escaped earlier, but now she felt the hot sting of a dozen more behind her eyes. She fought them back, blinking rapidly, not wanting to break the spell of the silence with her own noisy emotion. The music had spoken to her in a language she thought only she understood. It had seen her sacrifices, her loneliness, and her quiet, stubborn love for her art, and it had told her that it was all okay. It was more than okay. It was beautiful. She felt a connection to the girl on the stage that was deeper than any she had felt with another person in years. It was a connection of shared understanding, a silent sisterhood of souls who had found their voice not in words, but in the spaces between the notes. The young composer was staring at his notepad. His pen lay beside it, useless. The page was a mess of scribbled, crossed-out lines, a frantic, failed attempt to capture the uncapturable. He felt like a child who had just been told that the alphabet he had so painstakingly learned was only a tiny, insignificant part of a much larger, more complex language. Everything he thought he knew about music, about harmony, about structure, about the very definition of beauty, had been proven wrong in the span of a few minutes. The music Alara had played was a living, breathing thing, and his tools of analysis were like a child's plastic toys, utterly inadequate to the task of understanding it. He felt a profound sense of humility, but also a thrilling, terrifying spark of inspiration. He realized he had a choice. He could either retreat to the safety of what he knew, or he could step off the edge of the cliff into the unknown, and try to learn this new, terrifyingly honest language of the heart. Slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, Alara opened her eyes. They were clear and calm, but they held a distant look, as if she were still seeing the world from which she had just returned. She lowered the violin from her shoulder, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look for approval. She did not wait for a reaction. She simply held the instrument for a moment, her cheek resting against its warm wood, a gesture of quiet farewell. Then, with the same gentle care she had shown at the beginning, she placed it back in its old velvet-lined case. The click of the latches closing was the first sound to break the heavy silence, and it sounded as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. She picked up the case and turned to leave. As she reached the edge of the stage, she paused and looked back at the three of them. They were still frozen in their respective postures of shock and wonder. She didn't smile or bow. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet respect, as if to say, "Thank you for listening." Then she turned and walked away, her scuffed shoes silent on the floor. The heavy door at the back of the hall opened, and for a moment, a slice of the ordinary world, the sound of a distant car horn, the glare of the outside light spilled into the sacred space. Then the door swung shut, and she was gone. The three of them were left alone with the silence. The man with the silver beard finally drew a shaky breath, the sound loud and ragged in the quiet room. He looked at the woman beside him, and for the first time that day, he saw her not as a colleague, but as a fellow human being who had just shared an impossible experience. Her eyes were wide and glistening. He looked at the young composer, who was staring at the empty stage as if he had just seen a ghost. They didn't need to speak. The silence was still speaking for them, telling them that what they had just witnessed was not an audition. It was a revelation. It was a moment that would not just be remembered. It would be carried. It would change the way they listened to music, the way they taught it, and perhaps even the way they lived their lives. The day was over. Nothing that could possibly follow would ever matter. A full week had passed since the girl with the violin had walked out of the Great Hall, but for the three people on the scholarship committee, it felt like both a lifetime and a single, drawn-out moment. The silence she had left behind had lingered, a ghost in their minds that colored every sound they heard. The man with the silver beard found himself unable to listen to the radio in his car. Every song, every symphony felt hollow, a cheap imitation of the truth he had witnessed. He would sit in his study at night, a glass of wine untouched on the table, and just listen to the quiet hum of the house. A silence that now felt more meaningful than any music he had ever studied. The woman with the glasses had gone back to her teaching. But she was a different professor. She found herself listening to her students in a new way. She was less interested in the flawless execution of a scale and more interested in the tiny hesitation, The slight variation in dynamics, the small, human imperfections that revealed a personality, a feeling. She would stop a student in the middle of a piece and ask, not, "What was the composer trying to say here?" but "What are you trying to say?" Her students were confused, but also intrigued. They could feel a shift in her, a new warmth and patience that hadn't been there before. The young composer had not written a single note of music. He had filled pages with sketches, with fragments of ideas, but he would always crumple them up and throw them away. They all felt like lies. He was trying to build beautiful, logical structures with notes, but he kept hearing Alara's music in his head. A music that was beautiful because it was illogical, because it was a messy, glorious, honest expression of a human life. He was frustrated, but he was also more alive than he had ever been. He felt like he was standing on the shore of a vast, undiscovered ocean, and he was terrified and exhilarated, and he knew he could never go back to the small, safe pond he had been swimming in. They never formally discussed the audition. There was no meeting, no debate. The day after it happened, the man with the silver beard had come into his office, taken the official scholarship award form from a drawer, and sat down at his desk. He wrote her name, Laura, on the line with a steady hand. He checked the box for full scholarship, didn't need to consult with the others. He knew, with a certainty that defied all his professional experience, that there was no other choice. When the woman with the glasses came in later with a stack of papers for him to sign, she saw the form on his desk. She didn't say a word. She just looked at it, then looked at him and gave a single, slow nod. The young composer saw it later that afternoon and understood. The decision had been made not in a committee room, but in the sacred silence of the hall. A unanimous vote cast by 3 hearts that had been forever changed. Meanwhile, in a small third-floor apartment that smelled of old books and brewing tea, Alara was living her life as if nothing had happened. The audition felt like a dream she had once had, vivid and powerful, but distant. She wasn't checking her mail, wasn't waiting by the phone. The performance had been its own reward. She had needed to play that music, to let it out of her where it had been living, and she had. The rest was just details. She was sitting by her open window, a gentle breeze ruffling the loose strands of her hair, playing a simple, cheerful folk tune on her violin. It was a song her grandmother used to hum, a melody full of sunshine and the smell of fresh-baked bread. It was the other side of the coin, the joy that balanced the sorrow. It was just as real, just as honest, and it was just for her. A few days later, a thick, official-looking envelope from the Albright Conservatory slid through her mail slot. It landed on the doormat with a soft thud. Alara picked it up when she came home, saw the crest, felt a flicker of some thin curiosity, perhaps, or a sense of duty. But she was in the middle of making soup, and the letter felt heavy with the weight of a world she wasn't sure she wanted to be a part of. She placed it on a small pile of mail on her kitchen table and forgot about it. That evening, her mentor came to visit. He was an old man named Silas, a former street musician with a face like a roadmap of a long and interesting life. He was the one who had found her, a scrawny kid trying to coax a tune from a cheap, battered violin in a city park. He was the one who had taught her not how to play the notes, but how to find the music inside herself. He saw the envelope on the table and tapped it with a finger that was stained with wood varnish. "Aren't you going to open your future?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Alara shrugged, stirring her soup. "The music is the future," she said. "The rest is just paperwork." Silas smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Maybe, but sometimes the paperwork lets you play your music for more people. And that's not a bad thing." He pushed the envelope toward her. "Open it." For me, with a small sigh, Alara wiped her hands on her apron and tore open the envelope. Inside was a formal letter printed on heavy cream paper. It was the standard congratulations text, offering her a full scholarship, covering tuition, room, and board. It was generous, impressive, and it felt completely disconnected from the girl who had played in the hall. She read it with a detached sense of surprise, then set it aside. But tucked behind the official letter was another sheet, this one folded in thirds. It was a different kind of paper, and it had handwriting on it. She unfolded it. It was from the woman on the committee, the one with the kind eyes and the red-rimmed glasses. The note read, "My dear Alara, I am writing to you not as a representative of the conservatory, but as a fellow listener. For years we have sat on that committee and searched for technical perfection. We have been trained to value precision, to admire speed, to reward flawless execution. We thought that was the pinnacle of art. You didn't give us perfection. You gave us truth. We asked for something simple to end a long day, and you gave us something so real, it was unreal. You reminded a tired old man why he fell in love with music in the first place. You reminded a frustrated young composer that there are more notes in the heart than on the page. And you reminded me that every sacrifice made for this art is worth it, because sometimes, just sometimes, it can touch another soul. What you played was not a performance. It was a conversation. And we are all so grateful that you let us listen. We would be honored if you would come and remind the rest of the world what music is truly for." Lara read the note once, then again. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a smile that started in her eyes and lit up her whole being. It wasn't a smile of pride or victory. It was a smile of connection. She hadn't played to win a place. She had played to be heard. And in the end, after all the notes had faded away, that was what they had truly wanted all along. She looked up at Silas, who was watching her with his gentle, knowing smile. She didn't have to say a word. He already understood. She had played for the music, but the music, it seemed, had been listening back.